Hello and welcome to My Book, a podcast on books and their authors, produced by Cine Ink in London. I'm Loveleen Kacker. In this episode, I'm going to be in conversation with Aakar Patel, who has edited and translated the so far untranslated essays of Saadat Hasan Manto in a book titled Why I Write.
Now, if I were to be asked why it is that I write, I would have an answer for that too. The most important reason is that I'm addicted to writing just as I am to drinking. When I don't write, I feel like I'm unclothed, like I haven't had a bath, like I haven't had my first drink. I don't actually write the stories, mind you, they write themselves, and that shouldn't be surprising. You see, I haven't had much education. I have, however, written 20 books, and I'm quite astonished at the thought of who the writer could possibly be. Clearly important enough a man to be taken to court so regularly for obscenity. When the fountain pen is not in my hand, I am merely Saadat Hasan, a man who knows and is able to express little. It is the pen that transforms me into Manto.
Saadat Hasan Manto, one of the most prolific and gifted Urdu writers that the Indian subcontinent has ever produced. He wrote 22 collections of short stories, 1 novel, 5 series of radio plays, 3 collections of essays, and 2 collections of personal sketches. He has been widely translated and published. I am pleased to have Aakar Patel online from Bangalore, India.
Thank you so much for having me, Lovely.
And I am in London. Welcome to my book, Aakar Patel. It's a surprise that you've been actually able to find 25 untranslated essays. Would you like to tell us, Aakar, where you found these 25 essays?
Well, I had bought the Kulliyat, which is the collected works of Manto, while I was walking down Delhi's Jama Masjid area, where they have something called Urdu Bazaar. And there was a set of books by him, 5 or 6 books, which I had bought but not gone through. One day, I think late in 2013, a friend of mine who's a film reviewer in Delhi, Suparna Sharma, asked me whether there were bits that Manto had written about Bollywood that hadn't been translated till that time. And I said I didn't know, and I would get back to her. And at some point in that day, I went to my bookshelves and I looked through a book called Manto Ke Mazameen, the essays of Manto. And in that compilation, I found that there were several essays which in fact had not been translated. They did not necessarily have to do with Bollywood per se, but they had to do with Manto's time in India before 1947. He left shortly after partition. His time in Bombay during the violence that took place during partition, and then some essays which he wrote after he moved to Pakistan.
First question that I would like to understand from you is that you was written somewhere or read somewhere that you learned how to read and write Urdu.
Well, I moved to Bombay from Surat at the age of 25, and I was a newspaper editor shortly thereafter for an English tabloid. This was owned by a company which also had an Urdu newspaper called Inqilab. And at some point, the proprietors of the newspaper, the Ansaris, asked me to also oversee the Urdu paper, which obviously at that point I couldn't read. But I got a series of Maulvis to come to me, whether at home or to the office, and teach me the script. I tried at first to learn how to read Arabic, which I could not succeed in doing. But what I did manage to do was to learn how to read Urdu in the Perso-Arabic script. And so having got that knowledge, this is going back about 23, 25 years or so.
So you read in the Urdu script or the Hindi script?
I read Manto in the Urdu script. So far as I know, the works that I translated in 2014 and 2 that I translated last year have not been transliterated into Hindi, and certainly at that point had not been translated into English.
How difficult is the whole process of translation? For example, when you see Khalid Hassan's foreword in his collection, he's used this sentence, a translation is a translation is a translation. It's very difficult to get the original flavor, especially of a language like Urdu.
I did find it especially difficult because I was not trying to emulate the lyricism of the writer. I was merely trying to communicate his meaning. And because it was non-fiction and because it was short essays, mostly between, say, 1,500 and 3,000 words or so, This did not seem to me, at least, to be especially difficult. Manto is also a very clean writer, unlike the classical Perso Urdu writers before his time and some during his time. He does not spend too much time deploying couplets and things like that. There is a rhythm, there's a cadence to the way that he writes. And that sort of lyricism is different from the idea of having flowery couplets of the sort that you would find in classical Urdu, which is not his style at all.
So you didn't find it difficult to translate him?
I didn't. It might be the case that somebody who knows his writing really well and has read my translations might feel that I haven't done justice to him, and that is fine. It is not my aim to be able to communicate Manto the writer through my translations. What I want to do is to communicate Manto the thinker.
One particular essay, which is God is Gracious in Pakistan, I really feel that's an essay which is, the flavor of it would be something else in the original language.
There was some where the content of emotion is very high. I think Manto wants to be a laid back writer where he's distanced himself from the subject at hand to a large extent. And he does it for many of the works, if not most, that I have translated. Having said that, there are some in which he is personally invested. And I think that here it would be the case that these would be read in quite a different tone. I think that one thing that helps the translator is that if you're living through a period which is similar to the one that the writer is going through, you can channel that writer in some ways, which would not be possible if you're doing a writer that is, say, 1,000 years ago or something like that. This is, we are going through in current history in India, a phase, an era that's in some ways similar to what Manto would have been familiar with. And I think that makes it relatively easy because you feel some of the same sentiment.
So let's come back to the book. Some of the essays are particularly endearing. And the one that I like was Meri Shadi, the story of my wedding. And he comes out as a particularly a softer person who's worried about bringing a young girl home and not having be able to provide her with the things that she might want.
Well, one knows very few people who have led the kind of life that Manto led. So to come to Bombay, live in a chawl with a shared toilet, to then make a sort of reasonable success out of life spent in Bombay rather quickly as a writer, which is unusual. You will find somebody like a Shah Rukh Khan or an Akshay Kumar who are fundamentally camera-facing people who tend to become famous quickly. Writers find it much more difficult. We can count them on the fingers of one hand, Javed Akhtar or Salim or Gulzar or people like that.
His nephew, Jalal, he in one of his essays on Manto has written, and he says that Manto was probably the most successful financially Urdu writers of that time, which is what you're also trying to say.
Well, yes, in his case, he begins as a journalist. So he's writing. He comes to Bombay, writes for a film magazine, dabbles with films. His films don't particularly do well, and there is none that's especially memorable or that has lived on, such as some of the films from that time have. But he also starts to write short stories and fiction. Here he takes off. Here he quickly becomes somebody who, in that era of Bollywood, where actors such as Ashok Kumar and the people before and after him were familiar with the higher Hindustani that Manto would be writing in, not necessarily classical Urdu with a lot of Persian, but just very beautiful, clean language with good intonation. They found that what he was writing and the sentiment and the things he was writing about, the material, was quite unique. And I think that is what made him popular.
So let's talk about his essays on the films, because right at the start you have been talking about how that particularly was at the back of your head. And we find in this collection there are at least 4 essays on films. Why I Can't Stand Bollywood, Virtuous Women in Cinema, a review of Sehgal's Zindagi, and What Bollywood Must Do. The first question that comes to everybody's mind is, where did you get the word Bollywood? Did the word Bollywood even exist at the time when he wrote?
No, it wasn't. It's of, I think, 70s coinage, and I could be mistaken, but it didn't exist then.
Then why did you use it?
There is no other way of describing a phenomenon that most of us now accept, but wasn't really prevalent at that point. We didn't have the access to foreign cinema or southern cinema in his time, and therefore for him cinema was just cinema. It was just the one thing that Bombay would actually produce. In our time, that has changed. And so the nomenclature would be different, but I don't think he would see it in any different way, because what he meant was the cinema, Hindi cinema produced out of Bombay.
But a lot of purists feel that the use of the word quote unquote Bollywood misleading for the
I
time.
think Manto would laugh at people who say that they are purists. I think that the idea that in a culture that is as bastardized as ours is, where there is no sense of
No,
purity
no,
at all.
that's not the point. The point is if the concept of the cinema as a wholesome, the way what Bollywood represents today, did it exist like that at that time?
It
In
did.
fact, there are some actors who say that the word Bollywood itself is not a very nice word to use for the Hindi film
Well, that is the
industry.
modern debate, I think, because, and rightly so, I think that the South, which tends to make bigger movies now than Bombay does, takes objection to the world seeing Indian cinema as being purely Bollywood. And that's fair, I think. That wasn't the case in the late 1930s.
But would you still use the word Bollywood if you were to translate them now?
I would. I think that that's the way that he meant the cinema industry of Bombay. And the only way that that is described today, except for a few people who might find offense to it, is Bollywood. I don't think it is an offensive word.
Anyway, now let's shall we move on from this? There's a the very interesting essay that he has is this entire frustration about the cinema. We know, as you said very rightly, that he never really became a very big success in the cinema. But this frustration about the artificiality of cinema, does it seem like a rant? I mean, everybody knows cinema is artificial, isn't it? And what
My guess is that anybody who's artistically minded will have some problem with the popularization of art. And so, while it is inescapable in a medium like cinema, where you have to necessarily cater to a much larger demographic than you would for, say, theater or, say, painting, the person who's sensitive and wants to do something higher, has the capacity to think of something higher, will have a problem. Having said that, I think it's also the case that he was comfortable with it. Had it not been for the events of the 40s and his fears, I think he would have remained in the film industry. He might have continued to whine about it, but I think that that is the place that he felt as his artistic home.
you did mention somewhere that you found these particular 25 essays that have been published in your book, Why I Write, of particular interest. So, and since they go both pre partition and post partition, did you pick them up only because they were unpublished, or was there any special interest in these particular 25
No,
essays?
the primary reason was they had not been published at that point in time. There was no narrative coherence. Some of them were clubbed together, such as those that had to do with his time in Bombay. Some of them were clubbed together because it had to do with his time in Bollywood, in the film industry. Some of them were clubbed together because they linked back to his time spent uh, after partition in the newly formed Pakistan. There were some essays that I liked but didn't work on because they had been translated, including from the work that I'm referring to, which is Manto Ki Mazamin. Khalid Hassan has translated his letters to Uncle Sam, which are
Yes.
part of this book, but I didn't touch. There remains, strangely enough, at least 2 dozen essays that are still not translated.
Which is a
So
surprise, isn't
it
it?
is a surprise to me. I don't know whether they
Hmm.
have been transliterated in the sense that they've been rendered into Hindi. I don't believe that is the case. And I think that there is certainly the space for somebody who is interested in him and wants to work on a translation to be able to get a book out, maybe even 2 books out, looking at the stuff that still hasn't been translated
That
purely
still
from
has
this
not
one
been.
book. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in this set of 25, which would you consider to be the most interesting? Why I Write? We never got round to talking about the essay Why I Write. And and it's a
So
very interesting thing about he says about going around with stories in his pocket.
yeah, I wrote my first novel until, there was about a decade between the time that I translated that story, that piece by him, and I wrote my novel, and I didn't really fully understand or grasp what it is that he was saying about the process of writing fiction. And it is only when I was going through the book today, just before we had this interview, and going through some of his words, where I realized that what I had gone through as a fiction writer was absolutely the same thing, that you don't really know where it is that the muse is going to come from, when she's going to appear. But the fact that you consider the story at the back of your mind till it sort of eventually pops up is how fiction is actually written. It's a remarkably short piece of work which describes the process of writing as thoroughly and as precisely and as beautifully as can be done. He has this quality to him. He can make material concise in a way that very few writers can. That would certainly be one of my favorites. I like the works on Bombay because they shine a light on things that we either tend to disbelieve or don't know too much about. And certainly, I like the essays on post 1947 Pakistan because you have an insider's view which is cynical, which is something that most of us on the subcontinent don't have. We tend to approach our country and our culture with a reverence which he does not
Yeah.
have.
God is gracious in Pakistan. That one particularly stands out in my mind. Now, would you like to read out something from the book? Any favorite piece of yours that?
Um, well, I think that there's no favorite, but I think that, ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to say how it is that I write. Now, I don't really understand the question and what how means. My dictionary informs me it means in what manner. What can I say about this? The best way of putting it is to say, well, I sit on a sofa in my living room, pile up a sheaf of paper, unscrew the cap of my fountain pen, and begin to write. My three little daughters play in the same room. I chat with them every so often. I settle their quarrels, sometimes while I'm tossing a salad for myself. Should someone drop in, I play host and chat with them too. But through all this, I continue to write. Now, if I were to be asked why it is that I write, I would have an answer for that too. The most important reason is that I'm addicted to writing just as I am to drinking. When I don't write, I feel like I'm unclothed, like I haven't had a bath, like I haven't had my first drink. I don't actually write the stories, mind you, they write themselves, and that shouldn't be surprising. You see, I haven't had much education. I have, however, written 20 books, and I'm quite astonished at the thought of who the writer could possibly be. Clearly important enough a man to be taken to court so regularly for obscenity. When the fountain pen is not in my hand, I am merely Saadat Hasan, a man who knows and is able to express little. It is the pen that transforms me into Manto. The story I'm working on is never on my mind or in my thoughts. It's always in my pockets, unnoticed. I keep exerting my mind so that I might squeeze out the opening paragraphs, but to no avail. I try to be a writer of stories, putting on the air of one and holding the right pose. I light one cigarette after another, but nothing comes out. In the end, I tire and lie down like a spent woman, exhausted from the exertion of unwritten stories. Then I get up and do other things. I feed the sparrows, take the trash out, and play with my little girls. Their shoes, those tiny shoes dispersed about the house, I collect and put in their place. The damn story lying unnoticed in my pocket doesn't come to mind. When the pressure begins to mount, I retire to the toilet and sit on the pot, but nothing comes out there either. It's said that every big man thinks in the loop. I can say with some evidence that I'm not a big man, for I've never had a productive thought there. It's quite amazing that I'm considered one of Pakistan's and India's big writers. I can only say that it's possible that I've tricked them into believing this shit. Forgive me. Now I'm speaking the language of the toilet. Truth be told, I promise you, I have no clue how it is that I write. When I'm at a loss for ideas, my wife, who manages our finances, says sternly, please stop thinking and begin writing. And so I pick up the pen and start scratching out a few lines. My mind is still empty, but by now my pocket is full. And of its own, as if by magic, a ripe story pops out. In that sense, I don't consider myself a writer so much as a pickpocket, one who picks his own pocket and hands over its contents to you. Have you ever seen such a fool as me? The story was published as मैं अफसाना क्यों कर लिखता हूँ.
Welcome back. I am in conversation with Aakar Patel, editor and translator of a collection of essays by Saadat Hasan Manto. The book is called Why I Write and has been published by Westland Publishers. Aakar is an author, a journalist, and an activist. His earlier two books are Our Hindu Rashtra, and The Price of the Modi Years. We will come back to those other books of Aakar later in the program. And yes, coming back to Manto Aakar, in the earlier part of the book, you have included a number of essays where he's recorded what he saw with the partition and all the destruction and everything else that went around it. But let's turn to the essays which show his life in Pakistan. Manto's life definitely seems to have taken a turn for the worse when he went to Pakistan. He's had an immensely creative time, but he also suffered extreme poverty and ill health. His writing became increasingly dark. What would you say to that?
It did become dark. I don't know whether much of it was because of his own life, but certainly it is true that he was traumatized enough in Bombay with young daughters to feel compelled to move away and to go across. His sister lived in Pakistan. He goes to Lahore. He gets a fairly nice house. So there is a place. There used to be a place. Now, a few years ago, it was torn down. A place called
Lakshmi Niwas.
Yes, a Lakshmi Mansion on the mall, and it was the building where Manishankar Iyer was born. Um, and Manto was given a flat there, a nice, open, airy flat where his daughter stayed with her husband till fairly recently. And so he lives there, but he doesn't have as much work as he might have had in Bombay. So while in Bombay, not only was he working on films, he was also working on scripts. He was also working on fiction. He was also writing plays. In Pakistan, the market for his material very quickly filters down to what Pakistanis, the newly formed Pakistani nation, wants to read about the stars of Bombay. So he spends most of his time making money, going to the magazine offices, writing sketches of the people that he knew while he's at the office. And that's how he makes his money, uses tongas to get by, is prosecuted for obscenity for the fourth time, and this time he's convicted by a court in Karachi. But seems to not mind, I think, at least Lahore that much, because he might have been familiar with it through his days in Amritsar, not very far from Lahore, and culturally quite close to it.
There was a non existent kind of a film industry if he was looking for work in films. And this court cases, which he seemed to have been getting one after the other.
He's not seen as a particularly great writer in his own time, I would say. I think he becomes much bigger after his death, and much, much after his death, not even sort of immediately after his death.
And he wasn't doing well financially either. So the challenge of looking after his family was probably also weighing down on him.
The memories that I met his family when I went to Pakistan, and it didn't appear to me that the word poverty would be sort of appropriate. They might have been hard pressed to sort of meet the bills at the end of the month, but it didn't seem to me to be an especially difficult life. He was, I'm told, a fairly not by his family, but I'm told that he was a fairly difficult man to live with towards the end of his life.
Was his life beginning to go to pieces by that time? What was happening with Manto?
I don't know if that's necessarily true. I've met all his daughters; they're wonderful, and I think that they don't reflect the kind of trauma that one tends to read into stories and anecdotes about what he was like in the late 40s. By the time that he was getting ready to go, and he left fairly early. I think that what is certainly true is that unlike, and this is in response to the first part of what you said, writing necessarily produces very large amounts of insecurity in writers. Writers never know whether they're doing a good job, whether they have produced something of quality, whether they have written something that will stand the test of time, whether their fellow writers will see it with the kind of respect that they want it to be seen in. With Manto, it was different. I think he felt instinctively that his writing was great, and he was right. And I don't think that he would have been surprised to know that in 2023, so many years after his passing, we are having a discussion, one person in the UK and one person in Bangalore, interested in this person's life, who we have spent time and invested time in reading and writing about. He would not be surprised by that. He would know that he knew when he lived, that he was a great writer. And I think that is what sets him apart. The smaller
Yes.
bits of his life, mistreating people, alcoholism, a lot of that tends to be what writers do. They tend to blame the outside world for not recognizing their genius. They tend to blame it for not being more sympathetic to their condition. Perhaps he was that way, I don't know. But the one thing that stands out very clearly is that he knew what stature he had in the pantheon of writers.
And which brings us to one more thing that I think we should touch upon, his treatment of women. Much has been said about how Manto had. I mean, he was very, and all his women were very strong characters. He spoke about breasts and he spoke about sexual desires, and his women were feisty. But there is another side of him also. One hears that he was conservative about his own daughters.
I didn't see that in meeting them. There is nothing conservative about them at all. Because I think girls and young women don't have necessarily all of the agency in our part of the world to overthrow what has been imposed on them immediately on the passing of the patriarch. It's not that simple. I have yet to see any evidence of the fact that he would have been conservative as South Asian men tend to be with women within the family in the same way, particularly for somebody who was living in that period almost a century ago. One thing that people ought to be familiar with when they read him should be his description of Bombay in the 40s. And I think while I won't read it, I'll just talk about it. I think that
Okay.
Bombay, because partition is sort of essentially the partition of two states, Bengal and Punjab, we don't necessarily know what it is that it meant to a place like Bombay, which in the 40s had voted for the Muslim League and now found itself in a space where it was unable to express its a religious nationalism in those parts of Bombay that were Muslim majority, but found itself in a new country where they were not wanted. And I think that historically speaking, his documentation of what everyday life was like, where you have a barafwala, somebody who's carting ice, people getting murdered, what that blood looks like, how it is that neighborhoods behaved with one another and the people that they had known only a few weeks or months before during that week of partition is quite moving, and it's also quite informative. I think that while he remains one of the most entertaining writers to read, particularly when he's writing in fiction, in his non-fiction, his journalistic approach to recording how it is that people negotiated Bombay, how it is that people had to remove their caps or put on their caps and so on just to get by in everyday life, how it is that executives wearing suits were treated in taxis. I think this is kind of remarkable material of which there is very little. And I would urge people, and they don't need to buy the book. I believe that my book has been pirated and uploaded on this website called libgen.rs. You can just download a copy for free. I would recommend highly that these essays, particularly on Bombay, be scanned through for what they reveal about Indianness. And I think, especially in the India of our time, his writing I find very relevant.
So let's link that with what, as you said, our times, because there has been a somewhat a romanticism of how Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs lived in the pre-partition era, and people seem to think that just seemed to happen overnight, and that majoritarianism did not exist, or but we know that that's not entirely correct, and that Hindu Mahasabha and all the rest of it was possibly always there, and certain amount of majoritarianism was lurking in the wings for a very, very long time. It was probably waiting for the right time. So, in this context, would you like to talk a little bit about your other book,
Sure. No, I think
Hindu Rashtra?
you're right. I think the subcontinent is generally speaking a majoritarian place. That if you were to study the history of Pakistan constitutionally, which I've done in one of my books, they begin by trying to elevate religion in the state from the point of view of a positive outlook, that we will try and make people believers, and that will lead to country where progress and modernity has not run ahead of the spiritual nature of man, that we will try and integrate. This is happening just a few years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So this is a concern that science is moving so far ahead of man's religious and spiritual self that the government needs to act. But very quickly, it kind of comes down to how do you target minorities. The same things happened in India. To a large extent, it's happened in Bangladesh. In India, I think that in the time of Manto, we have a Congress party which at its peak is 97% Hindu in its membership, which produces a reaction, and you've got a party that caters to the Muslim community. And we have exactly the same situation now, that if you look at modern India, the most popular party controlled by the most popular leader of our time does not have a Muslim MP in the Lok or Rajya Sabha, has not had a Muslim MP in two successive Lok Sabhas, 282 seats the first time, 303 seats the second time. It has more than 1100 MLAs across India, none of whom is a Muslim. So this is deliberate exclusion. So that is one part of it. And the other part is the introduction of laws that specifically target minorities, particularly Muslims, which for some reason our part of the world we can't let go of. That we have a problem with young women and girls covering their head if they belong to a particular community. Sikhs are actually allowed in the state that I live in, Karnataka, in the schools which prescribe uniform. Muslim girls and women may not cover their heads, but Sikh women and girls can, which seems to me to be coming out of a desire for persecution rather than for equality. And so we could go through the laws, there's lots of them. But I think the reality is what you said it was, that it was never this kind of halcyon place, this kind of idyllic place where we all lived in harmony. There was always the sentiment that if I have power, I'll make sure that I demonstrate it against those who are weaker than me, particularly minority.
I think it was a little bit more than that, if I can just say. I do think that fundamentally Hindus and Muslims have never lived in peace. So, of course, you might always will have an educated and a liberal kind of a set of people that will be civil to each other and meet each other. But at the fundamental level, I think this conflict has always existed.
Well, let's take my community. I come from Gujarat, from this community called Patidars. We control, to a large extent, this sect, which was at the root of the temple entry movement. So in the 1930s, the Dalits decide they want to come into our temples. We don't want them in. And what we do is we declare ourselves to be non-Hindus rather than let them in. Now, if I were to say to myself, what is the primary conflict that the Dalit has in his society? Is it what people eat? No, because he eats the same food as the non-Hindus do, as the non-upper caste Hindus do, I should say. Is the Muslim stopping him from coming into his prayer space? No, he's actually welcoming him, saying, please become a Muslim and come here. It is the Hindu upper caste that wants him out. So the idea, to my mind at least, that there is the primary fault line on the subcontinent is Hindu versus Muslim is, I think, demonstrably untrue. I live in a neighborhood which is a Muslim majority. I lived in a neighborhood in Bombay which was a Christian majority. I went to a Parsi school in Surat where I had to travel through a Parsi neighborhood all the time. There was no fundamental conflict there. Conflicts are produced. I'm not saying that this is the perfect space where people live in harmony and friendship all the time. But I think that politics introduces the element of friction that we, in our part of the world, use quite well.
So, but has politics produced this fiction now? What about the history of what happened earlier?
Pre 1947, Congress is 97% Hindu. In a part of the world,
yes, but the conflict was still there, wasn't it?
We didn't have the agency. You have the agency when you have politics. When you have kings ruling, there is a Maratha king ruling over Gujarat. I went to college to Baroda. The rulers of Baroda are not Gujaratis. They are Maharashtrians. Should one assume that there is a conflict between Gujaratis and Marathis? There is none, because rulers are rulers, kings are kings. No. Yeah, that's the way it works. We need to ask ourselves, when the British gave Indians agency through legislatures, how is it that we looked at ourselves as a nation? How is it that we looked on ourselves as communities? To some extent, after 1950, we gave justice to communities which we felt were marginalized by giving them reserved seats in the Lok Sabha. So you've got the scheduled tribes and the scheduled castes who both have a specific number of seats that gives them guaranteed space in a parliament. We don't have that for all communities. We don't have it for our largest minority, which is specifically excluded by the party now. If I cannot mature the instinct I have, if I'm primitive in my mindset, if I'm not able to look beyond community, if I'm not able to look beyond harassment and bullying through legislation, I will remain where I am. There is a reason why Bangladesh overtook India in per capita GDP in 2016-17. And the reason is that we are not focused on things like the economy. We are focused on the
No,
things.
but essentially what you're saying is that Hindus and Muslims did live in peace and it was brought in by the English or by special legislation. What is the premise that you're making?
There is no such thing as living peace and living war. We are the second largest part of the world in terms of population. If we were not living in peace, we would all have been dead.
So we were living well together and
We
it's the
still
English
do.
that brought
There
in
is
this.
no because that is who we are as people. When you have a majority of Muslims in Pakistan, the focus of the state and large parts of the population is on bullying the minorities. Exactly the same thing happens here. If you are a primitive people, this is what you will do. If you're a modern sort of people, you will focus on something else. We don't focus on something else.
So this part of the world is particularly primitive as far as religion is
It shows.
concerned.
You go out onto the street. If you walk out of the room that you're in and look at the traffic where you are, if I walk out of my room and look at the traffic where I am, and I would include myself in this, hum jahil hain. There is no question about that. To say that we are sophisticated but the outside world is to blame is to lie to ourselves.
In the context of the two books that you've written, we have a problem with the minorities feeling exploited and left out, and a number of laws also which seem to not be doing them justice. And on a daily basis, we hear all kinds of things. And so, situation in some ways is fairly similar to 1947 when minorities were forced out. What do the current Muslims who live in India do now? What is their future?
So I think that the problem in India is slightly bigger than a religious one. So I don't know if it is accurate to say that the problem is faced by one community alone. And the reason I'm saying this is twofold. One is that our larger problem is that no matter, and this is true no matter which party is in power here, we seem to have passed the era where you could transition hundreds of millions of people out of poverty into things, out of agriculture into things like light manufacturing, garments, assembly, and then sort of heavy industry and electronics. That era seems to have gone. And China seems to have been the last country to have done it half successfully, at least. It is only at $12,500 per capita GDP, nominal US dollars. But for us at 2,500, are there 30 more years of economic growth around the world where people are willing to send us work of that sort of garments, automobile, and so on? The consensus seems to be no, that there is no real pathway for countries of India's size to become modern. By modern, I mean have a modern economy. And so you have a country with a large number of people who are poor. In India, 60% of the population, and this number should actually be 67%, but we haven't had a census in the last 12 years. 800 million people depend on the government for 5 kilos of free grain every month. This is not a part of the world that is looking to become a superpower of any time in the future. And it doesn't seem particularly realistic to talk about it. So that's one part of the problem. The second part of the problem is that you can only solve those things that you acknowledge. If I am Vishwaguru, if I have entered my Amrit Kal, if I'm doing really well, I don't focus on things that somebody else might see as a problem. To give you a sort of everyday example, if my cycle is punctured or my car is punctured, and I don't accept the fact that there is a puncture, I will continue to drive it. My speed might slow down, the car might break up at some point. But as so long as I don't believe it, it remains in my head. That is where we are. The debates in this country, whether in media or in politics, are not about poverty, are not about
No.
what we are going to do with our
Any
generation.
social nothing about social indicators, about
No,
education, about women, about law and order.
no. They are not about that at all. They are about how it is that we can jail the opposition or people who dissent or journalists or the NGOs and keep them there without bail. They are about film stars' sons being jailed for 30 days, not being caught with any dope on them. And this is what the media will focus on for 3 weeks straight. People die in India of malnourishment and have for centuries. This is not new. But in 2023, is this the kind of thing that we ought to be focused on? We are not. The sad part is that we don't have people like Manto who tell these truths to us. Most Indians and most Pakistanis and most Bangladeshis, I would say, view the world from their community. We do not, I would view the world as a Hindu and as a Gujarati. I don't have sympathy for Muslims or for Christians. I don't believe in the right to propagate for Christians, though it is a fundamental right in the Constitution, Article 25, because I can only see the world through the lens of a Hindu man, upper caste Hindu man, I should say.
Upper caste. I was going to add
That's
that.
all of us are like that. We have very few people like Manto who can stand outside their religious identity and see the world. Manto would not have been in favor of women covering their head, but that's because he came from the liberal perspective. If he had understood the way that India evolved over the last 70 years, he would certainly have sympathy for the women who were turned down at the gates of the colleges and schools. But his view was primarily liberal in a way that very few of us have. And I think that this is one reason why we miss somebody like him in our time.
What we do need right now is a Manto who will turn the mirror on what the reality of India is, and for somebody who tells you that you need to focus on the right things, and the right things have totally escaped not just the politicians but the media. I mean, you're very correct. There's hardly a TV debate on which you hear any conversation around education or literacy or poverty or jobs, but that's a discussion for another day. Thank you, Aakar, for a very lively discussion. You have been listening to a conversation with Aakar Patel, editor and translator of a compendium of essays by Saadat Hasan Manto. The book is called Why I Write and published by Westland Publishers. I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast, and we would love to hear from you if you have any questions or any comments. Do write to us at post@cineink.com. In the next episode of my book, we will be back with another author and another book. This podcast has been produced by Achla Sharma and Parvez Alam for Cineink. To listen to this episode and other episodes, do visit our website www.cineink.com. Cineink podcasts are also available on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcast, and YouTube. Thank you for listening to this podcast by Cineink. Until we meet again, this is Loveleen Kacker. Goodbye.